Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being patient. Here's season 3, the first episode of this season. In this episode, I talked to Dr. Emily Roberts, who is a personal finance educator specializing in early career PhDs. Through her business, Personal Finance for PhDs, she equips graduate students, postdocs, and PhDs with real jobs to make the most of their money. She gives seminars at universities and for associations, interviews PhDs on her podcast, which is also called Personal Finance for PhDs, and serves as a money coach and creates courses and workshops on taxes, investing, and more. Emily holds a PhD in biomedical engineering from Duke University and lives in Orange County, California, with her husband and 2 children. This was such an informative episode, and I had a great time talking to Emily. In this episode, we cover quite a lot of things that I think are practical. You might really just actually need to grab pen and paper for this or take notes. We talk about how to plan for your PhD or graduate studies before you go there, what to consider. We also talk about strategies with those that have already started in grad school. And we also talk about, information that students from disadvantaged backgrounds, underrepresented communities, and marginalized communities need to consider when thinking about their personal finances. And so I really, really hope you enjoy this episode. I do just want to say that this episode was actually recorded last year in 2020. And just because of what has been going on in the world and also in my own academic life, I was not able to bring this to you earlier. However, thankfully, the information is evergreen and it is something that really just goes beyond, I guess, time in itself. And so, this has been really great and I hope you enjoy it. So here I am with Emily Roberts. Emily, thank you so much for doing this interview and for finding the time to speak with me.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
I really appreciate it. So let's begin as I begin every other episode. Can you tell us more about yourself through your academic journey and how you got to be where you are today?
Absolutely. Happy to. Yeah, so my name's Emily Roberts. My business is called Personal Finance for PhDs, and I started out, as a graduate student. I went to college, then I did a 1-year postbac at the National Institutes of Health, and then I went to graduate school. So I spent 6 years doing my PhD at Duke University in biomedical engineering, and I knew, my career plans going into graduate school were, yes, I want to finish my PhD. I want to do research, but no, I don't want to be a professor. So academia was never like my goal. I really loved my experience at the NIH. So I thought I really want to be like an investigator at, another kind of setting like the NIH. Then a couple years into my PhD, it was, I'm not really wanting to do research anymore. I want to have one of these, alternative careers, not that they're actually alternative, but careers for PhDs outside academia and outside of even research. And then as I continued going on, it became, oh, wow, I am so passionate about personal finance. That passion was growing kind of all through my grad school journey. And by the time I finished my PhD, I'd been blogging about personal finance for a few years, and I realized, oh, wow, like people in my own community, like graduate students and other PhDs are finding my blog about personal finance, and like they're asking me questions and they're like wondering, how I'm doing my research and so forth. And I just realized, wow, my own community needs more targeted support around personal finance. And I think I'm the person to provide that, basically. So essentially, I did a little bit more work in other PhD related areas after I finished, but basically I started my business right away and went into it pretty much full time within a year of finishing my PhD. And I've been doing that for about 5 years now. I think I'm 6 years out of my PhD. So about 5 years full-time in my business. And I do a lot of things through that. One of my major pieces of work is that I speak at universities. I give seminars and now webinars for universities on the topic of personal finance for graduate students and postdocs. I also have a podcast also called the Personal Finance for PhDs podcast, same as my business name. A lot of other stuff going on too. I run a community I have lots of products. I help people, especially around taxes and investing. And so, yep, just all the like particular weird personal finance problems and issues that people have during graduate school that even sometimes can linger, beyond that into their
Right.
careers and so forth. That's what I try to address.
Right. Your podcast is really great. That's actually how I came in touch with your work. And it's really cool to hear that you actually started all of this work soon after your graduate school, and during actually is when you started blogging about it. So now I want to get into personal finance, which you said is something that you became interested in during your graduate program. And why do you think PhDs and anyone in graduate school for that matter should really care about personal finance? Why are you looking at this particular and specific community?
I have so many reasons, but I think the main one that might sum up all the other ones, which we can still talk about, but the main one is that your time in graduate school is still your real life. Okay. Time is actually still passing. You are still getting older. The habits that you are, practicing right now are going to carry forward into your later life. You don't get a magical timeout period from your real life just because you happen to be a student. And I think that's especially true for PhDs because we spend a relatively long period of time in PhD training between actually being a student and then being a postdoc. Like that period can last, well, I'm speaking from a US perspective, that period can last for 5, 10, more than 10 years in that training period. And so that's an awfully long period of time for you to expect, financial woes to, stay away from your door, right? So it really does matter what you do with your 20s and your 30s financially a lot. And to just say, well, I'm in graduate school, so I just get a pass on thinking about my finances. Wow, that is a real, wasted opportunity in terms of the time value of money, right? Like how much work you could do in your 20s to benefit you later on. So, of course, it is difficult and possibly unpleasant to think about working on your finances during a really financially challenging time, such as graduate school, but that doesn't mean it's not worthwhile to put in a little bit of effort.
You really talk about how time is important, and how sometimes we think that when we're in grad school time has paused, or is that we're not necessarily leaving real life. And I think that's a really important reminder. But before getting to grad school, people do research, right, to apply to grad school and to do their PhD programs. Are there any things that you would advise the audience to think about and consider when they're applying for school, and for PhDs particularly?
So what I think is really common, and what I did when I was applying to graduate school, is I was determined to only care about the research possibilities, the advisor I might work with, maybe the strength of the program, like academically, reputation wise. Those were the only things that I told myself I would care about. And I got really lucky that I happened to choose a PhD program that paid decently well, that was in a moderate cost of living area, Durham, North Carolina. That was not intentional on my part, but it was absolutely instrumental to my financial success during graduate school that I happened to choose a program that paid relatively well, relative to the local cost of living. And so when you're selecting schools to apply to, shoot for the moon, apply to a lot of places, that's great. But I think once you actually come down to a pool of, okay, these are the places that accepted me, it is important to take into consideration lifestyle stuff that will come into play, not just the research. So that could be, do I like the city? Do I like the geography? Do I have any friends or family nearby? Maybe do I like the setting? Of mountainous or like by the water, whatever it is. And I think personal finance should come into play there as well. And so I want students to look really, really carefully at the ratio between the stipend that you're being offered and the local cost of living. My rule of thumb when I speak broadly to people is that the stipend should definitely exceed what's called like the local living wage. I like to use, for the US, I like to use the living wage database that MIT provides, which is livingwage.mit.edu. You can look up like the city or the county that the university is in and get the local living wage. I mean, bare minimum is that the stipend should exceed the local living wage. Ideally, it should be maybe at least 25% above the local living wage. If you choose a program that does not pay you that well compared to the local living wage, and unfortunately there are a lot of programs that don't pay very well, you just have to go in with your eyes open that your personal finances are going to be a point of struggle throughout your entire time in graduate school, unless you manage to set up a really lucrative side hustle or something. So you don't have to choose, solely based on that, I would say, but I just want all students to have like a great level of awareness of what they're setting themselves up for when they choose a PhD program. Again, ideally, it would pay you a decent amount above the local living wage. That's really challenging in high cost of living areas, and also for programs that don't have as much funding. So it's not at all a guarantee. You have to look really, really carefully. It's also great to ask when you're in the interviewing process, when you're doing campus visits and such, or in any way that you can sort of get in contact with current students, to ask them about how their finances are during graduate school. Like, how much do you pay in rent? Are you able to save? Are you able to pay down debt? Or are you living basically paycheck to paycheck? So you can get a feel also, not just from the numbers, but by talking with students about their experiences.
That's really great advice and very particular and specific resources, which I'll put in the show notes for sure. Outside funding and outside knowing the local cost of living, is there anything else that you advise students to look for on school websites? Any resources that schools generally usually provide? Or is there any other way to go about trying to create that safety net for yourself as you're researching?
Yeah, so I know at least in the US, universities vary quite a lot in what they might offer students in terms of, emergency aid, for example. Some places have programs like that in place, some don't, some are working on it. I would say that a good place to go is probably the Graduate Student Association or the Graduate Student Government page, and they're the most likely to have lists of resources available at that university for, finances, or even for things like housing. Like, sometimes the aid from universities could come in the form of like cash or loans, but it can also come in the form of subsidized services. So, for example, some universities offer subsidized housing, which is always a limited resource. Like, not everyone can have access to that. And so when you're selecting a university, or when you enter a university, if they do offer subsidized housing, it's great to know how to work that system. Like, how do you get into the subsidized housing? What makes that happen? And so finding that out even before you are selecting your housing is a great idea. So the GSA or the Graduate Student Government would have information about that ideally. Another thing would be like subsidized childcare. So if you have a child going into graduate school, I think you need to be even more highly selective for universities that offer services and support to student parents, because that's not going to be universal. I did a really great episode, I believe it was in season 2 of my podcast, with a graduate student at the University of Oregon who is a single parent. And so she was very, very selective about which university she attended based on the services that were available to her as a student parent, which is not at all universal. So you just also have to think about your specific circumstances. Like, another example would be like students with certain like chronic health conditions. I also have interviewed someone on a podcast who chose your university essentially based on the health insurance that was offered. Because again, in the US, it can be very expensive to have a chronic illness, even if you do have insurance. And so the type of insurance that you have could really matter, and do they cover, your particular, therapeutics that you need for your condition? That's another thing to select on if you have that kind of special circumstance. So one other thing to consider, which is I almost like don't want to even bring this up as like a personal finance person, but as a student, you may have the opportunity to take out student loans. I'm again speaking from a US perspective, not if you're an international student, unless you have, a US like guarantor. But if you are a domestic student, you should have the opportunity to take out student loans. I don't love to encourage taking out student loans, especially for someone who is, fully funded at the graduate level. It shouldn't be necessary all the time. But I think if you have no, let's say, backup plan, like if you have no, for instance, familial financial support that you could fall back on in the case of an emergency, I think it's worthwhile to at least investigate what your student loan options are through the university. And I say that because if you do have an emergency that comes up and you haven't yet generated your own, little nest egg of savings that could help you out in that case. So maybe your first year, maybe this is your first job. If you don't yet have that, personal wherewithal to step in the case of an emergency, turning to student loans is not your worst option available to you. So, for instance, another option, if you again have no other people in your life that you could turn to for loans, another option would be like credit card debt, which credit card debt is horrible. Basically, it's at a really high interest rate. It's very difficult to deal with. You have to make payments all the time versus taking out a student loan. A well-considered student loan, not for frivolous reasons, but a well-considered student loan can be at a decently low interest rate, not low, but like manageable interest rate. It's likely to be unsubsidized, at the graduate level, which means that it'll still be accruing interest while you're in graduate school. But you can put it into deferment. So, for instance, I did an interview recently on my podcast about someone who, encountered some financial emergency during her graduate degree, and she did turn to credit cards in that emergency, but she also took out student loans. The brunt of our episode is about how to get out of that kind of debt. It's about her debt repayment journey. But she and I talked for a little while at the beginning of the episode about the relative merits of taking out student loan debt versus racking up credit card debt. Again, sort of in the case of an emergency. And so it's something that some people don't really think about as a graduate student who's being paid, that yes, you do still have access to student loans through your institution. And again, it's something that may just be worth looking into. If push comes to shove, you know that you have that option available to you. Again, if you are like a domestic graduate student. Unfortunately, international graduate students without a domestic guarantor would not have that same kind of backup plan. So that's not available to them, but it's something else to look into. Again, not frivolously. I don't want people going into debt like willy-nilly, but in terms of like, do I take out credit card debt or do I take out student loan debt? The student loan might be the better option.
Amazing. You've just pointed to a lot of different factors that encompass finance. It's not just about the money you're getting, such as the income. It's also about things that can be subsidized and, I guess, services that you need to consider as well. My next question now is to do with strategies for those that are already in grad school or in school in general and are trying to get a hold of their personal finance and control it a bit more and be able to create some more leverage for themselves. Do you have any particular strategies that you can point to that you can advise the audience to be looking into?
Yes, I have several in mind. And if you go to, my website, pfforphds.com, that's pfforphds.com, you will find these in like so much detail everywhere, all over my website. So I'll just mention them really briefly. The first one already came up, but I just want to underline it, is like your selection of where you go to graduate school is probably the biggest determiner in whether or not, how much success you can have with your finances. That ratio between the stipend and the local cost of living. So I want to emphasize that again. So number one, are you being paid enough or decently well? Of course, budgeting is a wonderful strategy to be using all throughout graduate school. I sort of divide budgeting into two actions. One is tracking your spending, and one is actually budgeting, that is projecting, this is where I want to spend. The tracking is the where did I actually spend. And so putting those two things together helps keep you accountable to your actual plan. And so, of course, I recommend budgeting. There's many different software packages that could help you with that, or you can use your own spreadsheets if you like that sort of thing. So many tools to help you with that. But I really think a budget is vital for anyone in graduate school, just about everyone in general, but especially in graduate school, when you're living on a pretty limited income, you need to be having a plan for where it's going to go. Another strategy that sort of ties in with budgeting, and this may be a new one to some people, is what I call a system of targeted savings accounts, also known as sinking funds. So this ties in with a budgeting overall process, but what it is basically is that you, for any expenses that are going to be relatively large compared to your cash flow, like for instance, buying a flight, or like maybe paying your, estimated tax if you need to do that, or even maybe paying for like a research conference or something like that.
These are
Any
really
of
great
these large
strategies.
expenses that might
And
sort of
I think there are a lot of
overwhelm your
tools
cash
out there
flow,
as well.
instead of what most people do is they would just throw it on a credit card if they have access to that and then pay it off over a few months. This strategy forces you to save up in advance for these kinds of purchases. And so, you sort of have to think ahead. I recommend over about the coming year, and ask yourself, what's going to happen in terms of these large irregular expenses, non-monthly expenses, what's going to happen that I can start to plan for. Maybe that's like your car insurance premium that you pay every 6 months. or maybe that's certain fees that you have to pay to your school. What's going to happen? And then what do I want to happen? Like, is there any, for instance, travel or entertainment that I want to spend on? Or is there a big purchase that I want to make that's going to take several months at least to save up for? And then the third question is, what do I fear happening? So for example, if you know that your laptop is getting up there in years and like you think at any point it could kind of give out on you, it's a great idea to start saving up for that eventual purchase of a new laptop, even before yours actually, kicks the bucket. And so through using this strategy, you save up in advance for these various expenses. And the reason that I talk about targeted savings accounts or targeted savings buckets is that you actually save the money kind of to the side of your checking account in dedicated savings accounts, or one saving account that you sort of earmark for various different purposes. So you save up a little bit of money every single month for these various different, spending that you can anticipate. And then when you actually need to do the spending, you pull the money back from savings into your checking to pay for the expense. And so it's really a combination of like saving up in advance for purchases. And then also it forces you to actually predict what is going to, be coming towards you in terms of irregular expenses. Because I just know from my own experience and also talking with other graduate students that these irregular expenses, these large expenses that come up, once a year, a couple times a year, they can really bust up an otherwise pretty well-conceived budget. And you don't want to have, you don't want your budget to be messed up by something like that. So just know that these kinds of things are coming and take a little bit of time to plan and save for them in advance, if at all possible. Something that I wanted to note for, a lot of international students in the US and also students from other under-resourced communities, a lot of these students actually pay remittances to their families. This is not something I probably need to tell most of your audience, but a lot of students pay remittances to their families even while they're in graduate school. And it's not that uncommon, that maybe a graduate student even would be a relatively high earner within the family. And so you can, of course, write that sort of thing into your budget. Like if I'm going to be sending my family this fixed amount of money every single month, then you can write that into your budget. That's wonderful. And you can budget around it. Another way is that you can actually use this strategy of targeted savings to help out with those remittances. And so what I'm thinking is maybe you write into your budget, okay, I have X amount of money that I'm allocating towards going towards my family, but I'm not necessarily going to send that to them yet. I'm going to put it aside in the savings account, because some family dynamics work like this. Like some families, they may ask you for money at different times instead of you just sending a fixed amount. You can look at that particular savings bucket and say, okay, when your family asks you for money, this is the amount that I've allocated for them, since the last time they asked. This is the amount I have available to send to them. And that way you can help them out when they ask for it, but that there's ultimately a limit. Like you draw a personal boundary around, well, this is the amount that I know that I can afford to send you without, endangering my own personal finances. And this is what I'm willing to do. And you can have that set to the side. So whether it's something you write into your budget or whether it's something you use a targeted savings account for, you can use these different strategies to, plan for that if that is, what you're expected to do or what you want to do for your family.
That's very great. And are there any other strategies that you would recommend as well?
Yes. I tried to be brief, but I just love talking about this stuff so much.
No, it's great information.
Yeah. So the last two strategies that I want to mention, one is to pay yourself first. It's like super classic personal finance advice. But what it means is that you make reaching your own financial goals your top priority every single, month or every single time you're paid. So you receive your paycheck and then you transfer money into savings or into investments or into, your debt repayment process. Whatever it is, you do that right up front before you pay your bills, before you buy groceries, before you do any of that other basic stuff that is going to happen every single month. Because paying yourself first, again, you're making yourself your top priority. That means it'll actually happen. So what happens usually is that if you leave saving to be like your last priority every single month, somehow you get to the end of the month and there's no money left. That always happens. It's a human nature kind of thing to spend what you have available to you. And so, okay, that's not universally true for everybody, but it's true for most people. I know it's true for me. And so using the strategy of paying yourself first means that you know that you're going to meet those goals right up front. And the rest of the money that's sitting in your checking account is available for spending and is available for the rest of your budget and can be used towards, your fun discretionary expenses or whatever you want, because you've taken care of your financial goals right off the top. So love that strategy. It works really, really well. Honestly, I would not do any saving if I just didn't pay myself first consistently. And I set up auto drafts to make sure that I don't rely on myself even to remember to do it, right? It's all set up automatically. And then the last strategy is to look into earning a side income while you're in graduate school or even later in your training. This is not available to everyone. So again, speaking from US perspective, if you're on an F1 visa in the US or J1 visa, you can't side hustle in the sense that most people talk about it. You can't take a kind of side job. You can't be working for money on the side. Your visa doesn't allow it except for on-campus employment. There are certain things that it does allow, very, very limited circumstances. But generally, as an international student in the US, you don't have the same options that a domestic student does. So kind of have to put that out there. Like, you have to be super, super careful about what kind of side income you try to generate as an international student. But even as a domestic student, you also have to be careful because some programs, some schools, some departments, some fellowships will prohibit outside work, or maybe they'll allow only certain kinds of outside work and not other kinds. So when I say pursue a side hustle, it's not like open season to do anything that you want. You have to work within what's allowed based on your funding rules and your visa rules. But within that framework, if you are able to start generating a side income, it could be a wonderful, wonderful thing for your budget. Again, the stipend is like designed to maybe, sustain your basic living expenses. It's not really designed to do a whole lot more than that. And so if you want to do things like, building up savings or building up investments or paying down debt during graduate school, or even just having a bit of extra fun, a side income can be a great way to, make that happen, to go beyond your stipend. And my favorite kind of side hustle for people to pursue during graduate school or PhD training is what I call a career advancing side hustle. So it's one that serves the dual purpose of bringing in an extra income and also being something that you can add to your resume or add to your CV that will actually help you get, a better fellowship or another your first postgraduate school position, something that serves that dual purpose of, maybe it's something where you can demonstrate some of the skills that you're learning through your graduate program in a business environment, or maybe it's learning new skills, demonstrating skills you already have. It could just be expanding your network as well, like maybe just working with people who could be another, recommender when you ultimately apply for a full-time job. Any of these would count as like career advancing, or even just career like exploration too. Like, hey, I'm not sure if I want to work in this area after graduate school. Like, let me do an internship in that area right now and see what I see. So it can serve that dual purpose of, bringing extra income and also advancing your career. That's the one I love to recommend most. Of course, there are many kinds of side hustles that wouldn't do that would still bring in an income and, serve some other purposes in your life. And that's okay too. But definitely consider what you might do that can advance your career as well as bring in money, like consulting or teaching or, scientific writing or scientific editing. There are lots of kind of, flexible side hustles that can be done in just a few hours per week that won't impact your progress in your graduate program. I should add that as another caveat of like, don't get so involved in like side hustling that you actually, delay your progress through your program or your progress, towards your dissertation. Like that has to be your number one priority. And honestly, getting out of graduate school and getting out of a postdoc is going to be the best thing you can do for your finances, like not spending extra time at that low wage. So please don't, jeopardize that progress by all these other things that you might be doing. But if you can balance it, and if it helps your mental health, which it very well might, that's a great kind of thing to pursue. And it can really sort of free up, a financial like blockage that you might be experiencing during graduate school.
That's true. You did mention amongst the last two strategies, the classic personal finance advice, that is pay yourself first. And one of the things you mentioned was either savings account or to put it in some form of investments. Do you have any resources that you can point students to, either yours on your website or anywhere else, that students may start to look at as those things that they can consider as investments and how to go about that process?
Yes, I love talking about investing. The earlier on in life you start, that you're able to start, the better. Certainly you go to my website, pfforphds.com, and just search. There's a search bar at the bottom of the page. You can search for investing or investments. I have many, many, many articles and podcast episodes where this is discussed. But again, I have to speak of the U.S. perspective because this can obviously differ, country to country. if you're ready to start investing, of course, not every graduate student is ready. You've got to get some emergency savings in place first. That's always my first recommendation. You may have some debt to pay off, like maybe some credit card debt or something you want to deal with. But, and of course, I recommend that you do this short-term savings for like your targeted savings accounts and stuff. But anyway, if you're able to start investing, if your finances are ready for it, I always recommend starting with your retirement investing first. It's kind of counterintuitive, but you need to start with the furthest out goal first with investing, and that has to be your baseline and starting point for investing. So that's going to be retirement for almost everybody. In the US, it's a great idea to use what's called a tax-advantaged retirement account for this investing. So for most people, that would be like your employer provides you with a 401k or a 403b, but that almost never happens for graduate students. So the name of the game for graduate students is the Individual Retirement Arrangement, or IRA, which you can open up completely on your own. Doesn't have to do with your employer or non-employer, your university. You open it completely on your own. You can use a discount brokerage firm like Vanguard, Fidelity, or Charles Schwab. You can use a robo-advisor like Wealthfront or Betterment. There's lots of different platforms that you might go through. But open up this kind of tax-advantaged retirement account, and the contributions that you make, if you open like a Roth IRA, for example, you don't get a tax deduction up front, but the money gets to grow tax-free, and then you withdraw it in retirement tax-free. So it's a wonderful, wonderful vehicle that can help your investments grow to their maximal possible potential without being taxed along the way. So that's pretty US specific, but it's a great thing to start. You can contribute up to $6,000 to a Roth IRA in any given calendar year, as long as you have what's called taxable compensation. And through the end of 2019, fellowship recipients, so people who did not have W-2 income, like if you're on a training grant or a fellowship for your graduate student stipend, that was not taxable compensation, but starting in 2020, it is. So basically, any kind of graduate student who's receiving a stipend in the US is eligible to contribute to an IRA up to either $6,000 or the amount of their taxable compensation. So retirement investing, great idea. If you look up some exercises on the time value of money or the power of compound interest, it's absolutely incredible how much your money can grow and work for you over the decades. And that's, again, why you would start with your longest term goal first, which is usually retirement. And I have this one exercise that I show in my seminars, and I'll just summarize it super briefly. But if you invested $250 per month, which is 10% of a $30,000 per year stipend, if you invest $250 per month and you get an 8% average annual rate of return, let's say you do that for, you make that savings for 5 years during your PhD program, and then you get out of your PhD, let's say when you're 30, and you don't add any more money to that. This is just the $15,000 you can save during that early 5-year period. If you leave it alone for the next 50 years, so from age 30 to age 80, if you leave it alone, and again, at that 8% average annual rate of return, adding no more money to it, it turns into just shy of $1 million. Like, that's the amount of money that you might have in retirement if you're able to save that. That's a very significant savings rate for a graduate student, $250 per month, but it's not completely out of the question for someone who's pretty well funded in a decently not that high cost of living area. So that's this kind of effect that this time value of money can have. So again, I love to talk about investing. So many more resources on my website. Anyone who wants to have that conversation with me, I want to. One other thing I want to address about investing in the US is that a lot of international students think that they are not eligible to invest in the US. And it's true that they might not want to for some reason or another. Maybe they're not planning on staying in the US after their training. That could be a reason not to. But in general, it is a pretty good idea to start investing, even if you're not sure, like maybe you want to stay or you're not sure where you might go after graduate school. It's a great idea to start investing. And while there may be some brokerage firms that might elect to not work with someone on an F1 visa, for example, someone who doesn't have a social security number, that's not law, that's just policy. And so if you keep looking around and keep searching, you should be able to find a brokerage firm that will work with you, even if you're on like an F1 visa in the US. So one brokerage firm that I received a tip about, this hasn't been verified, but I heard that this brokerage firm called Interactive Brokers sort of advertises themselves as working with non-residents in the US. So that would be one, tip to sort of investigate down that route. So don't think that you can't invest just because you're an international student or postdoc. It is still a possibility for you.
Right. That's really great advice and very actionable. I do want to go back to something that you mentioned before we close up. You did mention remittances and how under-resourced students can budget for that. Are there any other things that, either in your experience or with all the interviews that you've done, you've noticed marginalized students need to consider for them to actually be stronger in the area of personal finance and what they can prepare for outside remittances?
Yeah, so one big issue for international students and also maybe undocumented students and perhaps other students who don't come from advantaged backgrounds, there's some awareness around this, but like the importance of building up a credit score. In the US, like if you're an international student, it doesn't matter how great credit you had in your home country, like it's all wiped out. The US doesn't recognize that usually. And so that's something that people are generally pretty aware of like, okay, I need to work on my credit score and what's the process for this? Usually it starts with getting a secured credit card, which is one where you put down a certain deposit and then you sort of spend your own money and then you pay it back. And eventually after 6 months or a year of doing that, you can have a good enough credit score that you can qualify for more conventional products like other credit cards, for example, or maybe an auto loan. If that's some students, they need to get a car and this is the way they do it, right? They have to build the credit first and then get a loan. So that's something to think about, but I think there's already a good deal of awareness around that. But what I've noticed is maybe an overfixation on credit as well. Like, of course, credit is important to have. It's important for being able to take out loans, being able to take out debt products, being able to get into, certain housing. They'll be checking your credit score. It's very important to have a good credit score. But that's not the end all be all of your personal finance journey, because beyond just like, getting into like housing and stuff and being able to take out other debt products, like the credit score does that for you, but it's not the same as having wealth, right? So I think, yes, work on your credit score, but simultaneously just work on having money around, like work on that savings. I mentioned earlier kind of I didn't phrase it this way, but the steps that I recommend that people work through is what I call my financial framework for early career PhDs, including graduate students. Step one is like getting a baby emergency fund, which to me is somewhere between $1,000 and 2 months of expenses. So having that money is really, really valuable for these low-level emergencies that are very likely to crop up in your life. Maybe like once a year, you'll have some kind of low-level emergency. And then step two is paying off high-priority debt, such as credit card debt, anything at a high interest rate. Step three is preparing for short-term expenses, like what I mentioned earlier, these irregular expenses that might come up in the next year, or even if you're going through a career transition or a move, something like that, like saving up for a moving, expenses fund, or, for a lapse in employment, that kind of thing. Step four is when, I mentioned this, that's when you would start investing for retirement. And then the steps go on beyond that as well. But those are the first few. So beyond just like working on credit, which is a known issue, I would say just working on savings and getting that built up as quickly and robustly as you can. And as I mentioned earlier, student loans are kind of, even for communities that have student loans available to them, they're almost like vilified. Like a lot of, for instance, I learned this at a conference I went to last year, a lot of like lower income students who come from lower income families are very, very debt averse, which is super smart in a sense. Like debt is something that, constrains your choices in the future because you are, compelled to do the debt repayment. But taking out student loan debt, for example, is not, as I mentioned earlier, the worst of your options when push comes to shove. And so I think it's about like examining the mindsets around money. I actually say this for everybody. Everybody has a mindset around money that you have come to this point in your life with. And it really would behoove you to take a little bit of time and examine, where do these attitudes, where do these thought patterns come from? And are they serving me well? And are they also factually, accurate? So, I just mentioned in the investing example, there's like these endemic rumors in the international student community that you can't invest just because you're an international graduate student in the US. That's not true. And there may be other things in your money mindset that are it's just not fact-based. And so it's really worthwhile kind of examining your assumptions around what you can do with your finances or should do with your finances. And you may come up with, hey, that mindset serves me really well, and I'm going to keep that. Or you may come up with that mindset doesn't serve me very well, and it's something that I need to work on, shedding from my life. And it's an exercise, it takes some self-reflection. You need to slow down and do it. But I think it's really, really worthwhile for everybody when they're starting to, kind of become an adult and take charge of your own finances, is examining, where did these thoughts come from? And are they useful to me right now?
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that. Could you just tell the audience before we go into our rapid fire where they can find you online, where they can find your resources, and how they can join the PF for PhDs community as well?
Oh, happy to. Thank you. Yeah. So my website again is PF, that's for personal finance. So PFFORPHDS.com. That's the main place where you can find me, podcast episodes, all the articles I've written, kind of the hub for everything. I'm also on Twitter at PF for PhDs, kind of the same handle there. Those are two good places to find me. I did recently open a community, it's been absolutely fantastic. So it's basically for anyone pursuing a PhD or anyone who has a PhD who wants to, improve their financial education through accessing all the products I've made in the past. I have like workshops on taxes, for example. I have like an investing webinar series. I have ebooks I've written. There's all kinds of resources in there. Basically everything I've ever sold is now available inside this community. As well as you can connect with me. You can connect with other minded graduate students and postdocs and PhDs in the forum. We have conversations there. I put in prompts. We have weekly gratitude threads. We have a book club. Right now we're reading The 1 Week Budget by Tiffany Aliche. Next month we're going to read Your Money or Your Life by Vicki Rabin and Joe Dominguez. I have challenges. So my August challenge was actually opening an IRA, as I already talked about. I love talking about investing. This current month's challenge is starting your budget or working on your budget. So we have just all kinds of activity like that around improving your finances. And we also do monthly live Q&A calls, at least once per month, where you can, ask me any question you want or discuss things. So anyway, it's a lot of fun. And you can find that at pfforphds.community. So that's where you can go to find out more about the community. It is a paid membership because you do have access to a ton of really great resources. So yep, I encourage you to check it out if that sounds like, something that you could use in your life right now to help you accomplish your financial goals.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Before I go into rapid fire, is there anything that I missed out that you really feel like my audience would be glad to hear from you, or are you ready to wrap this up?
I think the one thing that I'll add is maybe final advice or final thought is going back to your initial question of, why should we care about personal finance in graduate school? And I just briefly mentioned this, but habit formation is really, really powerful. So even if you are not able to, let's say, do some of the things I mentioned, like growing your savings significantly or paying down a bunch of debt or investing, even if you aren't able to do that stuff with your stipend, which is certainly understandable, just paying attention to your finances, getting into the habit of budgeting, getting into the habit of saving, even if it's just, $5, pay yourself first, $5 per month, that's okay. These habits that you can ingrain in your life during graduate school will carry forward beyond that. And they can serve you really, really well. Once you have that postgraduate school higher income, you already have your, habits of mind, habits of practice in place in your finances. And you can basically just hit the ground running and make massive, fast progress with your finances. So if it can happen during graduate school, if you can grow your net worth during graduate school, that's amazing. Even if not, it's still great to be working on thinking about your finances and sort of becoming a person who is mindful about these kinds of issues. And it's just going to be fantastic later on in your life if you do that. If you choose not to, then that's going to be what you go into your postgraduate school life as well. You will still be someone who doesn't pay that much attention to finances, and eventually you'll have to. So why not turn it around early on and, use this time to create those great habits and ingrain them in yourself and in your life.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that advice. And so now we'll move on into our closing 3 questions. The first one, what has the current pandemic shown you about personal finance that you are going to keep for sure?
So something that I've really been learning through this, pandemic time, and also I would say through the podcast interviews I've been able to do, I've been learning a lot more about advocacy around personal finance than I ever, experienced or learned about during graduate school and earlier on in my own journey. So I really credit, the guests that I've had on my podcast for kind of teaching me about that. That sort of advocacy in the sense of, the graduate student environment, as well as advocacy more broadly, nationally or globally. And so what the pandemic has intensified for me is just like, of course, I was aware before that there are many aspects of like US, government and society, for example, that, I think could use improvement, but it's just intensified that feeling during this time. So I'm really thankful for, people in my life and through my business who have been showing me the ways, that you can advocate for others and for yourself. Because we do have a lot of work to do, both nationally and globally, to make it a more, equitable society. So that's something that is, on my mind during the pandemic. And I would say another thing that I'm learning sort of from my personal experiences during the pandemic is that it's okay to rely on others. And, in a time when a lot of our resources, especially public resources, have been sort of taken away from us or made a little bit more difficult to access. So for my own life, I'm thinking of like childcare. So like I haven't had, professional childcare since last March. So it's like 6 months with my 2 small children. And my husband and I both working from home, and, that's really tough. And so what I kind of accepted after, 5-6 months of doing that is that it's okay to rely on other people for help. So what we've actually done really recently within the last few weeks is we moved in with my husband's parents. So now we have like this sort of 2 household combined situation, which is something that I never would have, considered outside of this pandemic environment. But it's just been, it's an incredible blessing. I'm so happy that they have, allowed us to like move into their home, which we had a long-term plan of moving closer to them anyway. So the pandemic kind of accelerated that. So anyway, we get this like period of respite basically where we're staying with them, and, we have less financial burdens on us, and we have childcare, more so at least from them. And eventually we'll move on and, get into our own household again. But it's just, it's sort of humbling, but, really wonderful. And the pandemic absolutely taught me that, because I would have never considered this outside of being sort of forced into, just learning that like relying just on ourselves is super difficult and unsustainable. And it's okay to accept help from others.
That's true. That's true. That's something that's definitely going to stay, I think, with a lot of people. The second question is, what are you currently enjoying reading, watching, or doing that is sparking joy for you?
Sparking joy for me. Wow. Well, what I'm currently reading is, as I mentioned earlier, The 1 Week Budget by Tiffany Aliche, the Budgetnista. And I decided to add her book into the book club selection for my community, because something I'm really enjoying is actually her podcast. So after listening to her podcast, which she co-hosts, the name is Brown Ambition. So I've really been enjoying listening to that. And so I decided to add her book in to sort of get her perspective on budgeting, because Brown Ambition is more about like, yes, it's somewhat about personal finance, but it's more about like career ambition. And so that is definitely sparking joy for me, like having discovered, I mean, she's been around for a while. I didn't discover it, but like, starting to listen to her podcast has been really wonderful. In general, as you might expect from someone who is a podcaster, I love listening to podcasts. And so something that always sparks joy for me, and I always look forward to every week actually, is Office Ladies, because I'm a huge fan of The Office, and I just love listening to, those 2 women discuss the show. And anyway, it's really wonderful. It's like sort of a highlight of my podcasting week, I would say.
For sure, for sure. I have also discovered a lot of new different podcasts during this pandemic that I wouldn't have if I had my normal routine. But the final question for you is, if you had only $50 to your name, how would you spend it?
Do I have to spend it? Maybe that's a question. $50 to my name. How do I spend it? Okay, so as a personal finance person, I would say I would definitely put away $5, 10% for like future savings or something, emergencies. The other $45, how would I spend it? Is this something like, oh gosh, I'm so like practical. Is this something that could be like pleasurable?
That's exactly what I want to see. Different guests choose different things, right? And whatever it is that comes to your mind.
Yes. So I think the thing that's coming to my mind right now is I honestly would probably spend it on like preschool supplies. So something I'm now involved with is, homeschool, preschooling my two small children.
Right.
And it turns out that kids go through a lot of like consumables like paper and paint and like stickers and, things like that. So it's really fun. I love doing it with them, the curriculum that I purchased with them. But they do go through a lot of consumables and a lot of stuff. And it's great for their like development, I guess. And so that's something that I'm like learning, that it's okay to spend money on something like paper that to me might seem like a little bit frivolous, but like it's like actually vitally necessary for them to, work with their hands and so forth to develop like, their own brains and their own like motor skills and so on. So yeah, I would say that it would probably be on like paper and stickers and stuff, but it's a bigger picture, an investment in like my children's development.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And that's a lovely answer, actually. Um, thank you so much for doing this interview. I really appreciate you taking the time. And I know reaching out to you was sort of out of the blue because I really loved your podcast. And I really hope everybody else gets to listen to it and check out your website and your work as well.
Well, thank you so much. It was a real delight to talk to you. This was a great interview. I had a lot of fun.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening to this episode. I really hope you were able to walk away with some useful nuggets from it. As always, you can find us on social media. We are TEDx Media House now on Twitter. As you know, we rebranded last time. We are also TEDx Media House on Instagram. And do also check out the other in-house production that we have, another podcast called Taking Into Account, which I have with a co-host and a friend of mine called Desna. It's a pretty chill podcast. And everything that Emily has spoken about in this episode, which is her website and her podcast, will be in the show notes, so do check it out. And last, do not forget to support the show by going to our Patreon page. We are on Patreon as TEDx Media House. The link is also in the show notes, anything that you can give. You could also check out our merch. We do have merch. If you go to the TEDx Media House store on the Support Us page, you can get yourself some merch. Or if you really can't do any of that, please just do share the episodes with other people. Do share the episodes with your friends. Give us a review on iTunes. Tell us, what you like about the show. Or just write to me. Honestly, I quite like to hear what people are thinking. And thank you so much. Until next time, take care.